This is the 5-minute guide to the Iowa class battleships of the United States Navy.
So we're on to the Iowa class, arguably one of the most well-known battleship classes of history. This particular video will cover the Iowa class in general, and there will be a follow-up video regarding the USS Iowa herself, which will be next week, along with next week's regular video. So how did the Iowa class come about? Well, in the 1930s, a war against Japan in the Pacific looked the most likely, and the Japanese battle fleet was significantly faster than the 21-knot battle line of the American Navy at the time. So a number of new battleship classes had been developed, starting with the North Carolina class and then the South Dakota class, both armed with 9 16-inch guns and capable of speeds in the high 20 knots. In 1938, an evolution of the South Dakota class was planned. Initially, this was based around an armament of either 12 16-inch guns or 9 18-inch guns. Now, for you naval historians, that might sound a bit familiar, and yes, indeed, those design studies eventually split off to form the basis of the design for the Montana class. However, those designs called for more armor as well as heavier weapons, but speed remained at the 27 knots of the previous South Dakota class. Another design was pulled up, and this one was significantly faster, initially with 12 16-inch guns and 25-inch guns as a secondary armament, a top speed of 35 knots and a very long range. With the escalator clause of the London Naval Treaty invoked, the 35,000-ton weight limit that had constrained the South Dakota class could be lifted, and that's why all these improvements were being considered. However, one major restriction was in place, and that was the fact that this ship would have to go through the Panama Canal, otherwise known as having Panamax capability. However, whilst these so-called cruiser killer designs were prepared, it was just a bit of a step too far and a bit too complicated, so the whole thing went back to the drawing board with a basic expansion of the South Dakota class. Now, whilst this expanded version was capable of 33 knots, the General Board was a little bit put out that they were supposed to be increasing a battleship's displacement by 10,000 tons in exchange for effectively just 6 knots of speed and otherwise the same armament, armor, etc. And so they ordered a slight redesign to allow the ship to take the 16-inch 50 caliber guns left over from the Lexington and South Dakota classes of the 1920s, which would mean the ship at least would be slightly more heavily armed than the 16-inch 45 caliber guns of the South Dakota class. Unfortunately, the Bureau of Ordnance and the Bureau of Construction and Repair were responsible for the guns and the turrets respectively and didn't bother talking to each other, so they ended up with a turret that couldn't fit the guns, which was a little bit of a problem, so they ended up having to design a new 50 caliber gun anyway, the Mark 7. Minor design changes would continue to be made whilst the ships were under construction, but they eventually launched with an armament of 9 16-inch 50 caliber guns in 3 triple turrets, 2 superfiring forwards and 1 at the rear, with 25-inch guns in twin turrets as a secondary armament, 80 40mm Bofors guns and 49 20mm Orlikid guns for the anti-aircraft armament. However, the armour, at 12.1 inches thick, was no greater than that on the South Dakota, albeit that it was inclined at 19 degrees to give it a greater apparent thickness against incoming shell fire. This was necessary to allow the Iowa class to retain its 33-knot top speed and therefore escort the fast carrier groups that were rapidly becoming part of Pacific warfare. Early models of air search and surface search radar, along with a fairly advanced fire control system, were included to help direct all guns at their various targets. 6 ships were laid down: the Iowa, the New Jersey, the Missouri, the Wisconsin, the Illinois, and the Kentucky. However, only the first 4 would be completed in the end. Although they are very fast, very capable, and very powerful warships, it must be remembered that these are late 1930s-early 1940s designs. And aside from the Yamato class, which actually predates them, none of the other powers actually got to build the battleships that they were intending for this period. The respected American naval historian Norman Friedman writes, "For half a century prior to laying the Iowa class down, the US Navy had consistently advocated armor and firepower at the expense of speed. Even in adopting the fast battleships of the North Carolina class, it had preferred the slower of 2 alternative designs. Great and extensive improvements in machinery design had been used to minimize the increased power on the designs rather than to make extraordinarily powerful machinery and hence much higher speed. Yet the 4 largest battleships in the US Navy were not much more than 33-knot versions of the 27-knot 35,000-ton ships that had preceded them. The Iowas showed no advance at all in protection over the South Dakotas. The principal armament improved was more powerful 16-inch guns. 10,000 tons was a very great deal to pay for 6 knots, which to a degree matches up with what the Navy Board thought in the first place. And of course we know what the American Navy wanted in its ultimate battleship, and it wasn't an Iowa, it was the Montana. So you could even consider the Iowas to be the battlecruiser equivalents of the 1940s American capital ship fleet. And we'll get into that a bit more when we review things like the G3 class. The 4 ships that were launched saw service in World War II, and immediately after World War II there were plans to possibly equip them with nuclear missiles or extra aircraft, and in the case of the incomplete Illinois and Kentucky, there was a proposal to build them as aircraft carriers instead. This sat alongside another proposal to complete the Kentucky as a guided missile battleship, which would just be covered in all the missiles. Regardless of this, the completed ships would see service in Korea and Vietnam before being placed in reserve. And then in the 1980s, with the Soviet Kirov-class missile cruisers coming into service, the American President Ronald Reagan ordered the ships to be reactivated. At which point they were equipped with various fun things like Tomahawk missile launchers and Phalanx CIWS mounts. After active service in the Gulf War and other nearby locations, the New Jersey and the Missouri were decommissioned in the early 1990s, with the Wisconsin and the Iowa being decommissioned in 2006. So that's a very quick run through of the Iowa class. Sorry it couldn't be longer, but this is already 6.5 minutes. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to extend this series on the Iowa class, similar to what I did with the Queen Elizabeth class, as well as obviously the video on the Iowa herself.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below.